Welcome to the 9th of these video lessons. Today we're going to be looking at long-term change, fear of communism, and the weakness of the opposition, which are three relatively minor factors which can be used to explain why Hitler came to power, but nonetheless come up either in combination or on their own. So we'll be focusing on one-on-one, and unlike the other factors, we'll be fairly brief in certain circumstances, and not necessarily as detailed all the way through as we could be, purely because there's less to say here, and also these factors more rarely come up or tend to be part of a bucket of factors for one paragraph. So essentially the first argument about why Hitler came to power of this group is the fact that in reality, through a combination of the stuff that we've seen over previous lessons, the German people and the German elites were increasingly of an opinion that democracy wasn't working. And we've looked at this systematically through previous lessons, and this paragraph tends to be an amalgamation of several of the factors that we've mentioned into one paragraph under the bracket of long-term disinterest, long-term effects, long-term change, whatever you want to sort of name it. So there's nothing new here in terms of content. It's just about how you choose to marry up the different things we've mentioned across these video lessons. So we can mention, for example, the cultural authoritarianism, something we've mentioned previously, of the Kaiserreich political culture never was really eradicated. If you remember, you have a authoritarian right-wing dictatorship, and it loses power with the Kaiser kicked out, basically by the elite, particularly Hindenburg, but a lot else doesn't change. So the values people have, the economic and political arrangements often don't change, apart from the fact the Reichstag has more power. And that means that people who have learnt and have their values and have their understanding of what politics is before Weimar came into being, i.e. before 1918, which even in 1933 will be the majority of Germans, if you think about it. So only just over 15 years between the two gaps, between 1933 and 1918. These people were raised and lived a series of political norms which accept that the government should be powerful, accept that maybe the masses shouldn't be completely trusted if they want, are more suspicious of unbridled rights, free press, and are more suspicious of democracy. And what we can argue is that culture never quite goes. At best, in sort of November 1918, people are willing to give democracy a go. They've seen it works quite well in America. They've seen it works quite well in Britain and so on. But they haven't really got an experience of it themselves. And so while they're giving it a go, they've never quite lost that sort of default authoritarianism, that default anti-suspicion of democracy, that default sort of more towards that Hobbesian model of the state that we've talked about previously, the idea of the state should be stronger and ensure people are safe and limit the bad behaviours that humans inevitably do, rather than anything else. In addition, the elites and their long-term effect wouldn't exist. It doesn't happen overnight. It bleeds all the way through, from the Cat Putsch with the army refusing to defend the Weimar democracy, through the generosity of the judiciary for Hitler and various other right-wing extremists in the 1920s, through the systematic failure of the DNVP and civil service to do a lot to help the Weimar pro-democratic coalitions, through to Hindenburg and so on. So we can say the elites, all the way through the story, because they have always kept hold of the power from the Kaiserreich when they were given the power by the Kaisers various centuries ago, and the fact that they were not removed from their positions in the November 1918 revolution, which was a political revolution but not a social economic revolution. This sort of bleeds across and slowly eats away into this opinion of Weimar Germany. Stuff made worse by the fact that the Constitution, with its Article 48, empowers the president and proportional representation, eats away at the image that image that democracy is good and functions well. And that's something particularly mentioned in that lesson. The Treaty of Versailles and the ability of the right to use that issue as a sort of means to popularize themselves and make themselves increasingly legitimate. The 15 years of failure of the Weimar governments we've covered earlier, the long-term economic changes, particularly against the Mittelstand and against the farmers, and the changes in Weimar culture seemingly threaten quite a lot of people. These are all stuff we've mentioned before, and all combined to give this overall sense that Germany is failing. If you think 1918, people are cautiously going to give elections, electoral democracy a go, but as a result of these factors, you've got to imagine a slow bleed of support back to that belief that perhaps democracy doesn't work, back to the idea that authoritarianism, a strong man, will make Germany strong again, and this will in time create a majority of people who are anti-democracy, a majority of people who are willing to entertain other parties. And if you remember back from the presidential government part, this is something that's absolutely vital to give Hitler that electoral support, to the DNVP that support, and thus that ability to be invited to form a coalition and to be chancellor. So you can say in reality, each of these is a punch in the face, slowly eroding the sympathy and support amongst the average German for democracy. And remember, Hitler did not seize power, he was put into power by the Germans and their elites. These are the factors that enable and encourage this to happen. So this is often a preferred paragraph from students because it allows them to talk about a lot of little things and do a lot of analysis. I would say do not feel the necessity to do everything on this list. It will come across as just a series of statements because you won't have enough time to fully elaborate. But pick a couple, ideally a couple that are interrelated, and sort of how you can write one clear analysis which combines how they all work. Even if they have slightly different effects, you can sort of say how they bounce off one another. So maximum like 3, absolute maximum 4, and you sort of explain how this gradually, and a key analysis is erodes sympathy for democracy. You must focus on that and how that sort of sympathy generally disappears. So with that in mind, we're going to turn to the next, and for me actually a vitally important reason, and that is the fear of communism. Something we must remember, and I always say at the start of my introductory lessons in class, so some of you might have heard this already, is that the communist threats mean something very different to us than it does to them. We know the communists lose the Cold War. We know that Russia was bad, but fundamentally it kind of evened out and became, if anything, dull. If you are a German who values property, values order, values stability, values religion, which is the vast majority of them, the Communist Party represent a fundamental destruction of everything you know and love. They represent, and if you remember, the only model you've got for a successful Communist Party is 1917 Soviet Union, where the priests are being shot, everyone's property is being taken, so the social norms and the values that people have are being completely destroyed, and people are being shot if they keep on to them. Traditions are being destroyed. The political system has been completely returned, and a dictatorship of the working class is put in charge instead. This is a fundamental change to the existing world of Germany. And if you are someone who are the majority of Germans who have a support for at least one of these, this is a huge threat to your way of life. This is a fundamental threat. So this is not a left-wing party that will make you tax you more. This is a fundamental shift to how your life will be. So I compare this a lot to almost, and I'll probably get copyright, I'll probably get striked if I mention their name on YouTube. So I won't actually mention their name. But imagine if an extreme religious state was running 20% of the popular support in the polls and fighting police and other people on the street, and it looked poised to take over. This is seen as a catastrophic eventuality. And therefore, the fact that you have a party who represents such a fundamental change with about 20% of support of the average Germans, with armed groups who maraud the streets, this is seen as an existential threat to your very way of life. This is not just another political party. This is a threat to everything you know and love. And as particularly after the Great Depression, the support for KPD increase, the membership of the Red Brigades, the Red Front increase, and the numbers of strikes and protests you see, and the number of sort of Communist Party members beating up right-wingers and police you see on the streets, that only makes that panic worse. So you have a sort of almost an unease, and then you see an even more fundamental panic following through. So what we can say is that, particularly in combination with the Great Depression, Germans are terrified by the rise of the KPD. Now, before we move on, you must really make sure you emphasize in your essays. You don't have to explain in much detail, but the KPD never really was that much of a threat. They wanted revolution, and they wanted the complete change to the political, religious, moral and social life of Germany. Absolutely right. But they were never really likely to get it. Fundamentally, no one in the government liked them. Particularly in the army. In 1917 in Russia, that was different. And whoever owns the guns has the power, essentially. If the communists would have done a full-on revolution, much like 1918, 1919, 1920, they would have been gunned down on the streets. We don't know for sure, but the fact that they lacked support within the institutions of state, particularly the police and the army, and also just widespread support more generally, meant that they were less likely to actually ever be able to be successful if they were to try and do a revolution. In addition, they were woefully split internally, with different interpretations of Marxism, different regional groups and so on, disagreeing on strategy, and therefore never able to bring their huge numbers to bear. They were never able to support one another. So even if they tried to do a revolution, you would have some groups doing it, some groups not. You have had disagreements about who is doing what, and it wouldn't necessarily be well run, well organised, and therefore unlikely to succeed. And in particular, its leaders were always fighting amongst themselves and supported and picked entirely by Stalin. Stalin was keen to make sure he was head honcho of communism. And if that meant making sure that the leader of a communist party of a certain country was loyal over good, he would always go for loyal. And what that meant was you get people like Ernst Thälmann, who is incredibly loyal to Stalin, but not very well respected, not very good speaker, not very good at planning, not very good at logistics, and not very good at any way, shape or form politics, really, apart from giving speeches to the already converted. But because the leadership of the Communist Party was so poor, the likelihood that they were going to be a threat is minor. But this is politics, and this is history. It doesn't matter what the reality is, it's what people believed. And since people believed the KPD were an existential threat, even if they weren't, they acted as if they were. So where does this lead us to the question of why Hitler comes to power? Well, in reality, people cataclysmically terrified of the KPD look at the Weimar state doing very little about it. The Weimar state, based entirely, to some extent, on liberal ideas of free speech, but also weakened by the lack of strong coalition or even majority coalition governments in this period, hamstrung by the fact that the local areas tend to do their own things, and the sort of federalism and the independence of the sort of Junkers and elites in the local areas. Because of that, people look at a state not doing very much to deal with the communists. Politically, they can't ban the party, and their institutions aren't effective enough to fight them, and their appeal by 1930 particularly is so low that they're not people. The SPD is unlikely to have members go from the KPD to the SPD, but there's lots of people streaming from the increasingly discredited SPD to the KPD. So the state itself and the Democratic Party and democracy is seen as failed. Democracy has led to the Spartacus uprising, has led to a slowly rising KPD, has led to the violence following the Great Depression. However, they do see the NSDAP, particularly the SA, fighting the Red Front in the streets. In a place where the state refuses to do much, or at least that's how it looks, to see in the streets organised, uniform, ex-soldier, patriotic Germans taking the fight to the Red Front and usually winning, because they're usually better organised, usually more numerous, and usually better led, and winning. These public brawls, although they don't necessarily look refined and they don't make the Nazis look respectable, they do send the message that at least the NSDAP are doing this. At least the NSDAP are dealing with the Communist Front in lieu of the state. So while the NSDAP, in calmer, more polite times, may not have gained, considering how terrified increasing middle-class Germans, rural Germans, rich Germans are of the rise of the KPD, they're willing to put that distaste aside. They're willing to go, well, the means justify the end. It's not pretty, but at least it works. Commonly, the NSDAP, the lesser of two evils. The NSDAP do not represent a threat to your moral, political and social life. The NSDAP, if you remember, since rebranding, are about that traditional standard German coming forward. And so a good example of the sort of extent of the brawls is even in July 1932 alone, 100 members of the KPD are killed in street brawls, particularly by Nazis, although obviously each group has their own violent groups. Stauhelm, for example, on the right, and the Red Banners for the SDP. The police typically stand by. In particular, the police usually led by conservative elites at the senior levels. You don't have many rich men as constables, but you do have them as the guys in charge, generally are sympathetic to the actions of the Nazis. And as we saw in previous lessons, the police will generally particularly if the SA are winning, let them crack on and do this great propaganda. They only really step in on here and there and are very much on an ad hoc basis. Some local police forces, because police forces are very local and broken up into federal groups or sometimes even cities. These police tend to sort of, on average, just wait until people start bringing weapons out or people start getting seriously hurt. So the police basically let the SA have wonderful, what is called propaganda of the deed. Now, propaganda of the deed is an idea by Proudhon, an anarchist, and the idea is simple. Talk is cheap. Posters are cheap. And people might hear the same slogan 500 times, but nothing is more indicative of your political position than something they see happening, something big, something shocking, something violent. And therefore, what we can argue is the SA's violence and the SA's beating up of communism is precisely appealing to that fear of communism held by that moderate opinion. People who do not like the SA and often don't even like the Nazis and certainly don't approve of violence ruling politics. But these are extreme times. These are times of an imagined, at least, communist uprising any moment. And to see men in SA uniforms with the Nazi swastika on their arms is great branding for the idea that yes, democracy can't deal with it, yes, the standard old parties can't deal with it, but the Nazis can. And it is useful for that end to help explain. And so what we can say is, if we're going to sort of summarise that in a little bit more nuance, because of that fear of communism and the urgency, particularly after the Great Depression and the rise in KPD support, there was a sense of there's less space for a middle ground. The time to be reasonable has passed. It is either them or us. It is polarised. And therefore, most Germans will naturally say when it's them or theirs, side with the Nazis, and give the Nazis a legitimacy, gives the Nazis a respectability, or at least a justification to exist and vote for them, which they did not have perhaps before, because they're the only ones dealing with them. In addition, the Nazis, who often lack ideas which are popular, and because they tend to appeal to very narrow interests or tend to do just general slogans, the Nazis now can credibly campaign on being the only ones dealing with the communists, and thus, if they are voted into power, the only ones who would deal with the communists. They would sort the communists out in 3 months, according to them. And that is a legitimate issue. You see them beating up the communists. That does sound legit. Like, yeah, they probably would do it based on what they're doing, even when they're not in power. And therefore, a party which doesn't have that much issues, which they can campaign on, and it appeals to a broad sweep of Germans, this gives them one that they can credibly appeal to. If Germans did not fear communism, if they started shouting out communism, and like, for example, they were doing in the 1920s, and Germans didn't fear them, well, those were just those slogans wouldn't hit, and they sort of wouldn't lead to any support. For for that propaganda of the D to work, people must have a genuine fear. And this issue, as mentioned, is relatively undivisive. Everyone agrees, apart from communists and some SDP, that the communists are bad, and therefore is a quite good mass appeal issue. And particularly, what helps the Nazis brand themselves in opposition to the Weimar states. We are the ones who deal with it, and that emphasizes that broader failure of the Weimar state, broader loss of support. By the fact that people care about communism, you can see very starkly those who have failed and those who have succeeded. By looking at the failure of the Weimar state, it only emphasizes and reminds you of the other failures, the economic failures, the social failures, and so on. The failures themselves are somewhat imagined, and they are related to the long-term effects we mentioned previously. But this helps bring them into focus. So the fear of communism fails is only one failure, but this certainly helps that image of a tired, weak, bad Weimar state. And finally, many of the elite, who, if you remember, don't necessarily respect and definitely don't like Hitler, the DNVP is their natural party, not the Nazis, are also, they got the most to lose by the communist threat. They've got the greatest stake in this battle. And many of the elites who disapprove of the Nazis end up deciding to come into accommodation with Hitler purely based on the logic that it's better him than them. It's better Hitler than the communists. And therefore they find themselves, because of the heightened fear and the heightened focus and the heightened them and us between the communists and Nazis, and the heightened almost appeal of someone who at least deals with them, then what we find is there is a shift in perspective amongst the elite, at least a willingness to accommodate him. The one thing to mention about it, though, is fear of communism isn't all good. It's only one factor. Fear of communism alone, without the SA, without the organisation, without the propaganda to exploit it. Fear of communism without the elite in power to then do something about it, and so on. Fear of communism without an effective state. If the state was effective, this wouldn't be so much of an issue. This is something that Nazis exploit, but there are other factors involved. In addition, fear of communism means that Hitler has to use the SA. Problem is, the more he uses and relies on the SA, the more the SA start thinking that they're powerful, the more the SA start thinking independently, and the more headaches that they cause him. And we're going to talk a lot more details about this in the consolidation of power, but all you need to know is, from 1930 onwards, the SA increasingly get off the leash. They increasingly take their mandate of violence that they've been given to sort of rough up communists and start doing their own thing. They start actually killing people. They start fighting police. They start beating up SDP. They start beating up civilians. And this hurts that brand that Hitler's trying to make, that is, we are a party of respectability. Yes, we use force, but only because things are so bad. And because he has to keep that fear of communism and that brand, and he started that sort of SA thing going, he can't just to close down the SA overnight. Not only that would also cause a division in the party and a split in the party and weaken him. So we could argue that fear of communism is good, but it isn't perfect. It does create this tension because it does allow the SA to get off the leash a little bit. Something which, once you have let them off the leash, it's hard to sort of bring them back doing. The last reason, which has been blamed and is a weaker reason, is the weakness of the opposition. Essentially, if you look at that pie chart, you will see that the opposition, the non-extreme parties, so particularly the pro-democratic parties, increasingly find themselves squeezed. But at no point are they ever in a significant minority. And so one argument is, why don't they stop Hitler? Why don't they stop him? And unfortunately, the reason is that entire basis relies on a misunderstanding of the relationship between the SPD and KPD, but also a hindsight, a misunderstanding of how people viewed Hitler and what was going on. So when this question, or when a question asks the weakness of opposition is blame, one thing you must do in your essay is define who the opposition are. And you can say, traditionally it's meant to be, the opposition is meant to be the left, so the KPD and the SPD, and it's perfectly fine just doing them. But you can also say, well, technically, the Centre Party, the Liberal Party, the DDP, the Deutsche Volksparty, the sort of centre-right liberals, and the trade unions are all people who are justifiably in opposition to the Nazis. So you can feel free to bring them in as well. I'm primarily focusing on the KPD-SPD split because this also then goes into the next essay question, which is about consolidation of power. So the simple answer is the KPD and SPD will not unite against the Nazis because they are fundamentally different animals. The thesis goes, well, why don't they unite and fight back? Why they honestly did spend a lot of time fighting amongst themselves, discrediting each other, challenging each other, and they spent a lot of energy fighting within themselves as opposed to coordinating and fighting against Nazism. But this relies on the idea that they could have done something. They could have appealed to people more than they already appealed to, the middle classes. That's very unlikely in reality. It also, alternatively, suggests that they could have united in civil war and rebellion, revolution against the Nazis. And that's highly unlikely. So we're sort of left with the KPD and going, well, how do they do it? So before we even get to, and we will look at the reasons why they divide, you need to question the basis of, can opposition limit them? There are some opposition, the Centre Party, who could have stopped them, absolutely, and didn't for their own reasons, usually because actually the anti-communism, them and us, the fact that actually ideologically there's a lot of similarity, and the fact that a lot of these groups think they can control Hitler. They underestimate Hitler. But let's focus on the SPD and KPD and why they don't make friends. So the first thing is, the SPD initially did try and have some sort of revolution against and fight against them. So at least they're trying to stop the rise of Nazis. But that only helps the Nazis. The fact the KPD's Red Front fighters seizing various factories, fighting with police and that sort of stuff, as you've just seen in the previous slides, helps the Nazis get a brand, the anti-communist brand, helps the Nazis get support as a legitimate force fighting communism. So we can say the KPD did try and fight the Nazis and it only helped. In addition, as we've mentioned before, the KPD are incredibly divided amongst themselves with very poor leadership and very little support amongst normal Germans. Yes, some Germans support them and increasingly more working class support them to get them, but they're not really a force to be reckoned with. We can particularly say the German population is overwhelmingly Mittelstand, peasantry, elite or middle class. This isn't sort of Russia 1917. The institutions of the army, the state are strong. They will fight back effectively, unlike Russia. You will not have the mass appeal for revolution because there's a lot of people who gain from the system in this period. And therefore, why would you have a revolution? So the KPD are unlikely on their own to ever really try and do a massive revolution or fight back to destroy the Nazis. And when the KPD did, they end up helping the Nazis. So we can't, if we look at them, why didn't the KPD fight back? Well, they did, and they were rubbish. And they were unlikely to ever win. So anyway, we can ask, why didn't the SPD fight back? Well, the entire brand from day one of the SPD is that they are a moderate, anti-violent party of democratic capitalist system. They are a reasonable party. They are a moderate party of anti-violence. And their members believe that. If they didn't believe that, they would join the communists. And therefore, if they were to suddenly start saying, well, let's go and fight the Nazis on the street, the vast majority of membership won't listen to them. In fact, probably would leave them. And so, in reality, they are not the party of violence. They are not the party of sheer fight back. They're the party of systematic change. So, of course, they weren't going to fight back violently against the NSDAP. In addition, they genuinely saw the Nazis as a flash in the pan. They saw the Nazis as having promised loads but fundamentally not ever doing any better than anyone else. And they will eventually, like all the other parties, like the DNVP on the right, become discredited by their inability to get depression. They were complacent. They didn't see Hitler forming a dictatorship and destroying democracy in advance. They saw his rhetoric, but they just saw it as that, rhetoric. So they didn't see the need to do it because of their complacency. So the first premise of this entire argument, which is they should have fought back, violently, is false. Because the KPD tried, and actually it was counterproductive, and the SPD was never going to do that. Just because it's the fundamental thing which makes them the SPD is that they don't. So we can say, well, that's never going to happen. So the second argument is, well, why don't they at least unify, if not to fight, to politically coordinate against the Nazis, to coordinate the message, to act as a voting bloc, to make sure they spend their time fighting a common enemy rather than time, money and political capital fighting each other. Well, there's history between them, and they are fundamentally different beings. Just because both use the word socialism doesn't mean they're the same model. I would argue that the SPD probably has more in common politically with the Centre Party than the KPD. So let's go through that. Number one, there is a massive bad blood from the foundation of the Weimar democracy. The Eber-Groningen Agreement and the period in that chaos just as the Weimar state is established at the abdication of Weimar, where Ebert, the leader of the SPD and the then president of Germany, basically says to the army, yeah, do what you want against the left, we won't punish you. And that includes the murder by the Freikorps, completely extrajudiciously, of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the predominant leaders in the Spartakists who will then become the KPD. And so, at the very inception, there's blood on the SPD's hands. Its leader not only allowed the right-wing dogs of the Freikorps, as they saw it, to murder in cold blood the leaders, the sort of almost the most important communists. Ebert then, because of the Eber-Groningen, had to use Article 48 to retrospectively make that legal. Now, he didn't like it, he hated it, but this is Ebert. What else has he got to do? So, essentially, there's an original sin at the form of the relationship, which will always lead to bad blood between them, particularly the communists really distrusting the SPD. In addition, they are fundamentally different political bodies. One is a revolutionary form of socialism. The other is a gradualist party which takes social justice very seriously, but doesn't seriously see revolution happening anytime soon. The Social Democrats believe in democracy and capitalism. In fact, they think the only way to get change will be through democracy and capitalism. Whereas the KPD see that as a shrill. Essentially, the cornerstone of the KPD and why they rarely take their seats and they never participate in coalitions is they see democracy and they see welfare state as an anesthetics. They see it as almost anesthetizing the poor. They see democracy as a way of manipulating the poor into believing that things will improve in 20 years, things are fine, and basically sort of dying down, dampening their revolutionary spirit. It's about taming the working class by throwing them scraps. And since the SPT is literally defined by doing social reform within the capitalist and democratic system, they are seen as the worst traitors, as basically being complicit, and in some readers, deliberately complicit, in keeping the working class docile by destroying their revolutionary zeal. Now, you can say that's fair, you can say it's not, but that again leads to a massive tension between them in their ideology. Whereas the SPD, conversely, will look at the KPD as fundamentally harming the rights of the workers. They say that they look at the extremism and the unrealistic extremism and the revolutionary talk of the communists, and they see that as unnecessarily alienating for the middle classes and petty bourgeois and peasantry. They see that it unnecessarily puts them on edge for no gain. So if you speak reasonably and you ask reasonably and you have good arguments and you carry a majority, you can get reform. through compromise, you can get reform through moral weight. But for as long as you have a 10% screaming murder all the poor, murder all the rich, and have a revolution, then you don't have that anymore. It's harder to persuade that moderate. It's harder to persuade that compromise, because all socialists are then tired of that revolutionary, chaotic brush. So they look at the KPD as counterproductive. They see him as too extreme, as harming the mission. So there's a fundamental hostility here, only made worse by Stalin, but because he wanted to keep the ideological purity of the communists, and more importantly, because he wanted to make sure he kept control of them, demanded that the KPD refuse to cooperate with the SPD until well into 1932. And therefore his leader, he makes sure stays in power, Ernst Thälmann, basically advocates throughout this whole period that we will not work with the SPD. Now, to be fair, the SPD would not work with Thälmann, but there is no push as a result, because of Stalin's picking and support of Thälmann, for that unification. In addition, the SPD only lose by seeing to be allied with the KPD. Okay? If they ally the KPD, they will lose a ton of moderate voters who will see them as being too extreme. And yet, they were unlikely to gain voters from the KPD because they're already in the KPD. Why would you join the SPD again if the SPD get closer to the KPD? It's only loss. You only lose your centre ground and your traditional supporters if you become more extreme. That, and the fact that you see very clearly that the NSDAP and the police to a lesser extent are kicking in the heads of the KPD and increasingly pushing and assassinating the KPD. Why would you want to risk that happening to you and your members by associating with them? While there is some violence directed towards SPD, it's far, far less than that on the KPD. But to sort of move towards and make an alliance really limits that. And finally, what they both fundamentally do is misunderstand what is happening. Misunderstand what the story is going to play out like. They view, both of them, the Nazis as the last gasp of the sort of reactionary capitalists, people who are suffering as a result of the Great Depression. They view him as no different to anyone else. They see him as talking big game, but even if he gets into power, he'll quickly be discredited as he's unable to fix the Great Depression. And therefore, he's not a threat. So the only thing which arguably will make them unite is a fundamental threat to their very existence and lives. They do not see that in Hitler. They don't even see that in the first few years of him in power. And therefore, why would they overcome this? They don't see it as that threat. So in sum, the opposition are very unlikely to ever revolt. And they're very unlikely to unify given the fact that they are two fundamentally different groups. Now, why does this help, therefore? This allows the sort of NSDAP to attack the left, challenge the left, but only having to deal with only a small portion, i.e. the KPD side, only have to fight this small portion left. So NSDAP can say the left is bad, but only ever have a comeback from the KPD, because that's the only one they're really beating up in the streets. The SPD will not sit in solidarity, will not lend their support, their weight, their money, their rhetoric to defend the broader principles. They would prefer to sit quietly in the corner, watching nervously the NSDAP beating up and fighting and trashing the KPD, but happy to stay quiet. So the left is getting a bad name, the left is getting attacked, but it's not fighting back fully. In addition, because of the left couldn't come up with their own narrative, because the left couldn't sort of make a story that we don't stand for revolution, we stand for X, that allows that sort of polarization to happen. You're either with the communists or not. If you want, the only way you get out of polarization is you make a common ground argument. You say, no, we're not about violence, we're about good standard of living for all Germans, something like that. For that, you need a unified left. You need the SPD's voice. The SPD, because they didn't join, that's just simply not going to happen. In addition, because the left were divided, it wasted a lot of resources, time, money, skills, effort, as SPD and KPD spend as much time fighting and campaigning against each other as they do against the NSDAP, allowing the NSDAP more room to maneuver and making their job easier. So in overall, we can say yes, the division between the SPD and KPD particularly are significantly to blame for making the NSDAP's life easier. But what we can say is, but hang on, is it realistic that they would have ever joined? Just because both have socialist in the name doesn't mean they should have joined and really realistically would have. And in addition, what's the alternative? They join up and have a revolution against the state? That was never going to fail. They fixed the Weimar system? Well, they don't have a majority. And there's no way the communists would join the SPD if they're also allied with the KPD. So even if they did join up, they'll just form a bloc on the left, and the Weimar would just be as broken. Treaty of Vice still would have happened. The elites would still be in power, and the Nazis would still be popular. There's very little sense of and what. Even if they had joined together and campaigned, it's not clear that that would have helped them change anything. And in reality, considering that this is all decided and all led and all created by the elites, what would have been different? The elites put Hitler to power. They paid for him. They supported him. They subsidized him. None of this touches the elites. If anything, this would probably make the elites' job easier because they would need to paint everyone associated with democracy as somewhat bad. So in reality, we can really challenge the pretense of this question by going, well, in theory, yes, but actually, the reality, not so much. So, in sum, the long-term effects are a combination of factors we've looked at and fairly compelling. But the really thing I want to point out is, yes, these long-term effects exist, but there wasn't a revolution in 1928. There wasn't, Hitler came to power in 1927. Wasn't 28, wasn't 29, wasn't 30, wasn't 31, and wasn't 32. There must be a reason why. These long-term effects have been existing since then. So these are true, but they need a catalyst to make them happen. They need something to push over the line to Hitler to come to power. The fear of communism is a very compelling point. It certainly leads to a polarization. It certainly leads to the political circumstances where people are more willing and elites are more willing to entertain Hitler. But it still requires the Nazis to be able to exploit it, to be able to sell themselves and take advantage of that fear. Just because you hate communism doesn't mean you automatically go Nazis. They need to have branded themselves. In addition, it needs a flawed state who can't deal with the communists. In addition, it needs the elites in that position of power to make anything of it. So yes, the fear of communism is important, but in context of the exploitation by the Nazi parties and in the political context of Weimar at the time. And finally, the weakness of the opposition. It is completely true that the opposition's job, the opposition division between the communists and the socialists, made it easier for the Nazis. But it's not massively proven or clear whether had they united, how they would have united, and how that would have made a material difference to Nazis coming to power. Maybe the Nazis might have had to spend a bit more money on elections. That's it. And it's not massively clear apart from that, because it's not realistic that they would have united and had a revolution against Nazis. The army would always oppose them. They don't have mass support. So, with that in mind, when we look at these factors, these are great ones to put in, particularly to show if you're balancing, and particularly show how you combine these with other factors. And next session, we'll be looking at some of the final things before I'm going on to the next question. Until then, good luck, and I'll see you in the next video.